Hey guys, it's Kristen from Hooks, Books, and Wanderlust, and I'm so glad you're here because today we are going to start off a video series called Crochet 101, where I'm going to show you how to make the basic and most fundamental stitches of crochet. So grab your yarn and a hook and let's get started. Today we're going to learn how to tie on, basically how to make a slip knot, get a working loop on your hook, and how to chain stitch. So I hope you're ready. Let's get started. I'm working with Bernat Maker Home Deck yarn. It's a cotton yarn. It's kind of a tubular kind of structure. And I like it because it's going to show the stitch definition really well for you guys. So let's get started. So the first thing you're going to do when you start crochet is you need to tie on. You need to have a slip knot. So the way I do it, and I do this in a little bit of a more non-traditional way, I start with my yarn tail in my left hand, my working yarn in my right. Now, let's talk about that for just a quick second. You're going to notice it's all one big strand of yarn here, but we have kind of two different terms for it. So you have your yarn tail, that's the end of your yarn. And then you have your working yarn, which is the end that attaches to your skein. So when I go to make a slip knot, I keep my yarn tail in my left hand, my working yarn in my right. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a loop. I'm going to take my working yarn and I'm going to twist it over the top of my yarn tail to make a little loop. And you can see it's just resting on top here. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that working yarn and I'm going to kind of come underneath my loop. So now my loop is basically folded down on top of my working yarn. Hang on. Let's show that again. So I've got my yarn tail in my left hand, working yarn in my right. I'm going to make a loop and cross my working yarn over my yarn tail and take that working yarn and pull it up underneath that loop. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my hook and I'm going to insert my hook into the loop underneath the working yarn. And I'm just going to take my yarn tail and pull. Now I've got this lovely slip knot here, but this loop is huge, right? We're not going to work with it that big. To make that smaller, you just need to pull gently on your working yarn and it'll shorten that up for you. So now I've got my yarn tail, I've got my working yarn, and I've got what's referred to as a working loop. The loop that's on your hook is called a working loop. It's going to be there no matter what stitch you start, whether you're making a chain stitch or the most complex stitch. It is a working loop. It's basically what's going to connect your old stitch to your new stitch. But before we move on to our chain stitches, I want to talk just a really quick minute about how to wrap your yarn around your fingers. This is going to be something extremely customizable to you. It's something that's every crocheter probably wraps it differently. But one thing that I was learning when I was learning how to crochet, I probably watched 20 different videos just to see how people wrapped their yarn around their hand to hold everything when they got started crocheting. Because let's be honest, the trickiest part of learning how to crochet is learning how to hold everything. So I want to take a minute just to show you guys. So I've got my working yarn, that's the end, again, that attaches to the skein. And when I go to wrap my yarn, I hold it kind of like I do like if I was going to show off jewelry, like, oh, look at this beautiful bracelet. So I've got my yarn draped across my lower three fingers from my middle, ring, and pinky. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back up with my hook, pulling that yarn so that I go between my ring and my pinky finger and back up. So I'm basically just wrapping my center two fingers in this spiral of yarn. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull it behind my index finger. And now you'll notice that as I pull, the yarn can maintain some tension. Tension is going to be important. I don't always do it on, sometimes I do it underneath the pinky. Sometimes I do this so fast, sometimes I'm not even paying attention. So there, I always, I have to do it again just to be able to show it to you guys. So over those three, between my pinky and ring, back up under the index finger. And that's how I hold mine when I'm getting started anyway. And what I do is when I'm holding everything, at least when I'm getting started with my chains, I use my middle finger and my ring finger and my thumb, and I pinch that tail, that yarn end or the yarn tail. And that way all of my working yarn is coming right up off of my index finger here. So now that we know how to hold, and again, this is going to be one of those things that you got to do what's going to be the most comfortable for you. So I do recommend trying to watch as many different people wrap their yarn to see which one it feels the most comfortable and natural in your hands. So everybody does this differently. Don't think you're doing it wrong. It's cool. It's all right. Okay. So now that we've wrapped our yarn, I'm going to grab my yarn tail with my ring and middle fingers between those and my thumb. I'm going to hold that securely, and I'm going to do what we call a yarn over. This is a very common term in crochet, and yarn over simply refers to the act of taking the yarn from the back of the hook. See, the hook is in front of my working yarn, wrapping it around the hook and making sure that it's really good underneath the hook part of your hook. I feel like I just said hook like 100 million times. Okay, so that's a yarn over. I'm going to show you again, real slow here. We are going to wrap our yarn from the back to over the top of the hook and under and back under, so that we have basically encapsulated the hook in a little spiral of yarn. So from back to front, that's called a yarn over. That is going to be how you work the majority of your crochet stitches. It's very common, and being able to make sure that you're doing it in the correct direction is absolutely key, because if you try and do it this way, it's not going to be the same. You're going to slip your stitches a lot. You might end up with a totally different look. The best way to do it is to, from the back to the front, yarn over your hook. Okay? All right, great. Who's ready for a chain stitch? Let's do this. So I'm going to yarn over, and I've got this yarn, my working yarn is underneath my hook. I've got it really captured there, and I'm just going to gently pull that loop through the working loop. So now you see my working loop is down here. It's become this chain stitch, and I've got a new working loop up here. So let's do that again. Yarn over and pull it through your working loop. Let's do this again. Yarn over from back to front, pull through your working loop. This is called a chain stitch. The chain stitch is going to be one of the most common foundation type of stitches. And I say foundation because that means it's the building blocks from which you will build the rest of your crochet fabric. You will generally work into a row of chain stitches to get started on almost any project when you're first starting out on crochet. So you can see here that I am just working subsequent chains because I want to show you guys how important tension can be. Now, when I was showing you how I wrapped my yarn, I mentioned a little bit about tension. Tension is how tightly or how loosely you're holding your working yarn, so that when you work your stitches, it'll determine how tight or how loose your stitches are, or in this case, how big. So if you look at these chain stitches, they all are roughly the same size. But I want to show you what it looks like if you have too loose of a tension. You've maybe got, well, I can't even do it. There we go. So you might have one that's extra big. Pull out some more yarn here from my skein. So you've got one that's kind of big. Maybe you got too loose, and you're kind of falling all over the place. If you don't have proper tension, your hook might fall out, or you're going to end up with these kind of extra large chain stitches that you really probably don't want. And the other side of that coin is if you're holding it really tightly, like super tight, you're pulling on the yarn. So you see how much like the elasticity of this yarn, you can see how much I'm pulling on it. And if I'm doing it like this and I'm making those chains super, super tight, they end up really small. And that's going to be really hard to work into when you try and go work your first row of your pattern. So you really need to try and focus when you're very first getting started with crochet. Chain out like 50 or 60, or just keep chaining and chaining and chaining and keep chaining until you can make sure that you're getting those even sized stitches in a way that's comfortable for you, that isn't too tight so that you'll be able to work back into them later, but that it isn't too loose either. So you just yarn over and pull through those working loops. And that is super important because, like I said, with tension, if you're too tight and you try and go work into that stitch, it's going to be really hard, even with the pointiest of hooks, to get your hook into the chain stitch in order to make an actual crochet stitch. So moving on to the anatomy of your chains, I kind of wanted to take a minute for this as well. So you'll notice, and I'm going to just chain a few more here because I really want to make sure that this is evident for you. Okay, and I'm going to remove my hook. I can't talk today. So you're looking at the top of your stitches right now. And the one thing you're going to notice is you've got these little V's. Those V's are created from pulling that loop up. It's the loop of your working loop as it gets pulled, right? So it makes this little V where it's gotten pinched into the previous loop. So this is referred to commonly as the top V of your stitch. And you will always have that in a crochet stitch, no matter if it's a chain or one of the more complicated stitches, it's always going to have a top V because you've always got that working loop. So this is the top V. Most often when you're getting started, what you're going to do is you'll end up working your stitch right down into the middle of that V, like so. You'll just stick your hook right on in the middle. But I want to show you guys this other alternative. You'll notice on the back of, or the bottom here, it's actually better to see on a side view, so let's do that. So I've got the top and I'm turning it over, and you can kind of see this back bump that's created from, and that's how it links one chain to the next. So this is referred to as the back bump of your chain stitch. And I personally like to work into that back bump because when you're looking at the bottom of your fabric or the bottom edge of your fabric, it's going to have a more consistent, more polished look to it. So whichever one of those is going to be more comfortable for you, then do that definitely to start. But it is definitely worth practicing working into that back bump because it'll make such a nicer finished edge. So let me show you kind of the difference with that. So the first thing you're going to know about working with chain stitches is you are never going to work into the first chain from your hook. So I've got my working loop. Then I have my first chain, my second, my third from the hook, right? So you're never going to work into that first chain ever, because that'll end up basically just pulling out your stitch because you're coming out of it right now. So what you're going to do is, if you're working a single crochet, for example, that you would skip that first chain and work into the second. Now, as I showed you, if you're going to work into a chain and you're going to do it the most standard way, you're going to work into the center of that V. So I'm just going to do some quick single crochets here just so that I can show you what this looks like. We will get to single crochets in another video, and I will link it below when I have it out. So fret not there. Don't try and freak out because I'm going too fast to see how to do this. I just want to show off simply the chain stitches. So I've done enough here that you can see this, how there's so many gaps at the bottom here, and that's because we pulled one of those loops from our top V to make our stitches. And then you look at the bottom and it's kind of like this bumpy, ridgy, kind of twisted looking thing. So instead of working into the top V of our stitch, and I'm going to pull these out because I've deformed these stitches so much. So I'm going to pull those back. And now I'm going to show you what it looks like to work into the back bump. So again, I'm going to turn my work towards me so that I can see the back bump. I'm going to just show you real quick. So here's our first chain from our hook. And this is the first bump of the first chain from our hook. So we're not going to work into that one. We are going to work into the second one. So let me insert my hook back in. So I'm going to skip that first bump and I'm going to work into the second one. And as you can see, it's sometimes a little slower going. I think that chain stitches are kind of slower to get into just because there's not so much to hold. There's not as much like to grab onto and hold your work more securely. So you just kind of got to do the best you can with that. But now you can see the big difference. The first difference is no more gaping holes, right? Those are pretty much gone. And if you look at the bottom, this is the bottom of my foundation row now. So I have basically, because I worked into the bottom of my chain stitches, the top of my chain stitches is actually now becoming my the bottom edge of my work. So if you look at the bottom edge here, and then you look at the top edge, they look like identical. They match. I mean, yes, the loops are going in different directions, but they look identical. I think that that just gives you such a more polished, professional look to your projects. So I really do recommend trying to work on working into that back bump. So practice doing that. One other quick thing that I do want to show you as I redo some chains here. So we're going to yarn over and pull through that working loop to make our chains. I mentioned tension earlier, and one thing I forgot to mention to you is, you know, as you work your chain stitches, you are going to have to adjust your grip. So you might want to just move your thumb and your ring and middle fingers, or however you're holding it, you will have to adjust your grip as you work up higher on your chains. But the other thing I was going to mention, and this is something I started doing because when I first started crocheting, I used to crochet so loosely. And that was mostly because I would just try and go like this and without my finger tapping on that yarn. And so you can see how much looser those chains are versus my other starting chains here. And the reason for that is I got to this point where I would use my index finger and I actually hold my working loop when I'm yarning over so that I don't accidentally pull that loop higher than I want to. So I call it finger tapping. I don't know if there's a more correct term for it or not, but that's what I call it. So you can tell that makes things a little more uniform and standard and not as loosey-goosey as the other ones were. So that's another tip or trick that you might be able to use if you're having that same problem. If you're totally fine just doing, you know, not finger tapping and just going like this without your finger there, then by all means continue on as usual. But I definitely found that helpful, so I thought it was worth mentioning. So that is how you make chain stitches. That's how you work into chain stitches. We've gone over the anatomy and you know, when you're going to work into the top V versus the back bump. You should know that while this is most commonly used as a foundation for your pattern or for your fabric in general, it can actually be used in the fabric of your pattern as well, in the body of your pattern as well, because you can vary different stitches together with the chain stitch to create gaps or special other special stitches that are giving you more texture and more visual interest as well. So it's not just for the foundation. You can totally use this in your fabric as well, and you will. So yeah, I think our next video is going to be single crochet, and I will show you how to do that coming up next. So make sure that you are subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss it, and turn on those notifications. If you liked this tutorial, be sure to hit that like button for me. I sure do appreciate it. And until next time, you guys, I'll catch you then.